You work as an advocacy officer at عدالة for All, an association of jurists and lawyers that provides free pro bono legal. Thank you so much. We will now move on to غفران. You work as an advocacy officer at عدالة for All, an association of jurists and lawyers that provides free pro bono legal advice to victims. And you're also a prominent activist fighting against racism and discrimination. Can you please tell us more about the current situation for activists and civil society in Tunisia and what the impact of counterterrorism legislation has been on civic space? And have you yourself been impacted?
شكرا.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Human Rights Group. Thank you to all the attendants. I thank you for this opportunity to speak about the situation of civil society in Tunisia and the situation of activists in Tunisia, as well as the impact of counterterrorism legislation on civil liberties. I will speak today, as you mentioned, as a Tunisian activist and also as an advocacy officer in Adala for All. It is an association that aims to ensure justice everywhere in Africa. I will talk about the complex situation that human rights women and men working, human rights workers, women and men in Tunisia live in. Since the 25th of July 2021, we have seen a notable regression in public liberties as all executive authorities became concentrated in the hands of President Kais Saied. He eliminated all checks and balances, disbanded parliaments, and started issuing laws through presidential decrees such as Decree 117, which gave himself all legislative, executive, and judicial authorities. These are tantamount to a coup against the Constitution of 2014, the coup of the revolution. This has had a huge impact on the democratization process and on the work of civil society organizations. The general atmosphere of work of these civil society organizations has been an atmosphere of hostility and repression. In recent years and months, there has been an escalating crackdown on political activists, lawyers, journalists, trade unionists, and judges, as well as simple Tunisians, I say judges who did not accept the decisions of the current authorities. As I said, simple Tunisians who have nothing to do with politics or civil society have also been subject to a crackdown for simply criticizing the de facto authorities. In March of this year, the collective trial of 40 political opposition figures started for a supposed conspiracy against state security. This is a very serious charge that carries the death sentence. Under the penal or criminal code of Tunisia and under the basic law number 26 of 2015 on countering terrorism and money laundering, which was amended in 2019, the accused were charged with accusations including conspiracy to attack property and persons, conspiracy against the external and internal security of the state, attacks in order to topple the regime, engaging contacts with foreign agents to cause harm to the diplomatic status of the country, and engaging in offensive acts against the president. These trials are taking place in an environment of intimidation and harassment with numerous procedural flaws. From the beginning, the NGOs were not allowed to cover these cases in the media. However, the authorities were allowed to use the loyalist media to give a narrative that incites the public opinion against the accused. In this case, it was decided arbitrarily not to allow the accused to be present at their own trial. They had to participate by video. This is something that is considered by the accused as very worrying. It is worrying about the improbable fairness of these trials. as the guarantees of fair trial are hardly provided. Associations that worked against racial discrimination and called for peaceful coexistence and tolerance, that worked on issues of migration, or that denounced the abuse of migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, found that they were also targeted by counterterrorism laws. They were accused falsely of money laundering, of conspiracy, of threatening national security, attempting to change the demographic composition of the country, simply because these activists criticized the authorities. As a result, many of them were jailed. These repressive arrests did not come in a vacuum. They came within the context of official incitement through hatred rhetoric against migrants from sub-Saharan Africa. Instead of addressing this issue from a human rights and development perspective, civil society organizations were made to bear the responsibility for the situation. They were intimidated, they were imprisoned, these activists, when they were simply calling for a respect and for the most basic dignity for sub-Saharan Africans. A new draft law was also submitted on the creation of associations and NGOs. This draft bill is another tool to infringe on the freedom of association and to put CSOs under the control of the state. If adopted, there will be further arbitrary and enforced closures of independent NGOs. This jeopardizes the plurality of civil society in Tunisia. It is difficult for us today to even talk about restoring democracy in Tunisia. Now, to answer your question, the situation today in Tunisia is very worrying. We cannot continue to ignore these challenges. These laws on counterterrorism are dangerous. There are other decrees that are also used to crack down on voices of dissent. We must raise awareness about these violations and call for the protection of fundamental freedoms. Civil society plays a vital role in guaranteeing democracy and human rights. We should all defend civil society in these difficult circumstances. Tunisia today is at a crossroads. Either we accept repression or we fight to maintain what is left of our liberties. Thank you.
ألف عافية for your efforts.
Thank you so much. Criticized the authorities. As a result, many of them were jailed. These repressive arrests did not come in a vacuum. They came within the context of official incitement through hatred rhetoric against migrants from sub-Saharan Africa. Instead of addressing this issue from a human rights and development perspective, civil society organizations were made to bear the responsibility for the situation. They were intimidated, they were imprisoned, these activists, when they were simply calling for a respect and for the most basic dignity for sub-Saharan Africans. A new draft law was also submitted on the creation of associations and NGOs. This draft bill is another tool to infringe on the freedom of association and to put CSOs under the control of the state. If adopted, there will be further arbitrary and enforced closures of independent NGOs. This jeopardizes the plurality of civil society in Tunisia. It is difficult for us today to even talk about restoring democracy in Tunisia. Now, to answer your question, the situation today in Tunisia is very worrying. We cannot continue to ignore these challenges. These laws on counterterrorism are dangerous. There are other decrees that are also used to crack down on voices of dissent. We must raise awareness about these violations and call for the protection of fundamental freedoms. Civil society plays a vital role in guaranteeing democracy and human rights. We should all defend civil society in these difficult circumstances. Tunisia today is at a crossroads. Either we accept repression or we fight to maintain what is left of our liberties. Thank you.
ألف عافية for your efforts.
Thank you so much.
Tanya now. Tanya, you are Human Rights Officer at MENA Rights Group, a Geneva-based legal advocacy NGO defending and promoting fundamental.
So it's really difficult to carve out what is being now normalized in Israeli legal and political culture. Part of it is directed at Palestinians as Palestinians, and another part of it is directed against any form of liberalism, even those liberal islands that existed within Israeli political culture. So what you see is an attack on NGOs that, by the way, is not new, but now is gaining political traction because of October 7th. October 7th allowed a lot of policies that in the past were kind of pushed forward within the Knesset, but reached a roadblock because of international pressure, because of certain kind of political parties within the Zionist kind of stream or kind of party system. But now the NGO bill is trying to basically tax up to 80% those who receive most, I think maybe up to 50%, or those portions of their funding from foreign governments. Now, let me say one thing. A lot of experts have been looking at that law and at that bill. It's still a bill. And they're uncertain about certain definitions in it. It's not totally clear. So if you're receiving most of your funding from a foreign government, and a lot of NGOs in Israel, like, I mean, doesn't matter names, but they would be extinct because foreign governments don't want to put money in states. They're trying to fund NGOs. So it really signals the death of these organizations. The space in Israel, and I have two more sentences, the space for civic action and human rights law, like activism and defense in Israel, not only shrunk, it really is a few organizations, and the chilling effect is real. A lot of activists are out to the streets, and you can understand why. If you're being even suspected based on Article 24 of the counterterrorism law, it doesn't end with the arrest. You are put in the security sections of prisons where the conditions have been horrendous. People got scabies, were sleeping in overcrowded rooms with bugs, little food. So people who got arrested in October in a demonstration, a lawyer and an activist from al-Fahim, came out of prison telling horror stories. So you're not just risking the night at the police station, you're risking your health. And that's the price that's being exacted on activists. And that's why the space has shrunk so much.
Thank you for that very clear answer. Since we're nearing the end of time, I'm going to pass it on to Tanya, if there's anything that you wanted to say on the questions that had been asked, and if not, any final thoughts that you have or recommendations to member states, the UN, other international community or relevant stakeholders. And then it would be the same question for you as well, غفران, before we wrap up.
Thank you, Sarah. I think I'll just conclude by saying, looking forward, we really urge, regarding the issue of transnational repression, We want to urge the AIMC to listen to the UN human rights bodies and to civil society, and to respond to the communication received by UN special procedures, and to urgently reform its practices in line with international human rights law. And until such reforms are put in place, we call on states and international bodies to stop collaborating with the AIMC and contributing to its unlawful practices. We also call on the Arab League states to immediately cease proceeding with extraditions, which are requested on the basis of AIMC warrants, and to refrain from resorting to the AIMC to seek extraditions. We also urge Arab League member states to reform their counterterrorism and national security laws in conformity with international human rights standards, and to cease using them to silence and to punish people exercising their fundamental rights and freedoms within national borders and beyond. I want to remind Arab League states and the international community that the international principles of non-discrimination and non-refoulement are norms of jus cogens which must be respected by all states at all times without any possible restriction. And in order to uphold these principles, states must conduct an individual assessment of the risks faced by individuals if extradited, in particular risks of torture and arbitrary detention. And they also have the obligation to ensure that the extradition has not been requested on discriminatory grounds, including to prosecute or punish a person for their political opinions. And for those who have already been extradited because of the AIMC, like Kardawi, and who are currently in prison or who are forcibly disappeared, we call on relevant states to immediately release them and to provide them reparations. And we also urge the states of the Arab League to guarantee non-repetition, to stop perpetuating this climate of fear in the region, and to ensure an environment which is free of political repression, and where everyone can safely and freely express themselves as provided in international law. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
شكرا.
Thank you. Thank you once again. Before turning to the conclusions, I would like to recall here something important. Tunisia does not live in isolation. It is a member of the United Nations. It is signatory to numerous international conventions that it adhered to voluntarily. These conventions are not theoretical texts. They are legal obligations that aim at guaranteeing fundamental freedoms and human rights for all people, including right of freedom of expression, right of association, and independence of the courts. When we turn to UN bodies, we're not asking for something that is beyond the law. We are simply recalling these obligations and calling for their practical implementation. This is not trying to get support from the outside, as they claim. This is simply resorting to mechanisms that are available to all under international rules. What we are doing here today is part of natural and normal human rights activity. This is what civil society organizations do everywhere in order to ensure that countries abide by their obligations. Tunisia itself resorts to such mechanisms when it wants to seek protection for its own nationals or for other issues that have an international nature. So calling for the implementation of international obligations is not anti-state activity. It is legitimate activity within the legal framework that is accepted by the Tunisian state. Committing to international conventions is an obligation, and calling for the implementation of these obligations should not be construed as anti-state activities. They're at the heart of defending the human rights of all people and their fundamental freedoms. Our recommendations are to immediately release all prisoners of conscience and political prisoners. Tunisian authorities should release all those who have been detained for their political opinions or human rights activities and put an end to politicized trials, as well as abiding by international standards that prohibit arbitrary detention. These are the obligations of Tunisia under the ICCPR. Secondly, respect for the independence of the justice and stop politicizing justice. It is important to rehabilitate the independence of the judicial authority, to stop any political interference in the work of the judges, and to secure fair and public trials. It is also important to put an end to military trials of civilians in line with international human rights standards.
Time is up. I'm so sorry to cut you off. We unfortunately did not have time to get to the conclusions and recommendations of Fadi nor Ben Sol, but hopefully he will be around, as well as our other panelists afterwards, where we invite you to come speak and ask any remaining questions you may have. Thank you so much for joining this event. Thank you to our translators, and thank you to MENA Rights Group and Safer World.
On a commencé un peu tard.
Oui. On a commencé juste.